surfer chick, or at least, sorry, I'm putting it out there. Bit difficult to do when you live in Gauteng. And we're not talking about online surfing. But more importantly, whenever Madz comes down to Cape Town, there's a surfboard involved in the process. Now, let's get to the serious stuff, though. Madz Deyzel is a pastoral counselor, an author, a trainer, and an international speaker with over 30 years in ministry. Back in 2019, she launched Edify, which is building the soul and partnering with churches to address mental health in communities. Through Edify, she has developed CARE, C-A-R-E, courses to promote self-awareness and empower individuals to take charge of their mental well-being. Madz is dedicated to equipping both individuals and churches with practical tools for emotional and spiritual health. Put your hands together, ladies and gentlemen, for Madz Deyzel.
I'm like, sure, who is that chick? She sounds pretty cool. Sorry, this computer's doing its own thing. Oh, wow, you're controlling it from the back. I like it. Actually, this is fun. Yeah, I'll kind of move around. Well, I have to say, it really is an honor to be here. And, yeah, I feel like I'm in a room full of legends. And, you know, speaking was not always a comfortable space for me. When I was in high school, I had to go for elocution lessons. It actually felt more like execution lessons, learning to speak. But I'm incredibly grateful for who God is and the work He's done in my life. He's a God of transformation and restoration and healing and wholeness. And as a counselor, I have the privilege of hearing people's stories. You're in the world of sharing stories, and I'm in the private space of hearing often those behind-the-scenes stories, those painful stories. And I'm so aware that we live in a world where the enemy is rampant and wanting to rob, steal, destroy. And so I want to speak into a space that's not a common space when it comes to mental wellness. Because often we wanted to speak in the basics of, you know, what are the great foundations to renewing your mind or, you know, managing your emotions. But as I was preparing, I realized that, you know, if you have the privileged position of being what we call, and I love the title of this conference, Kingdom Voices, which really do speak life and hope and healing into a broken, hopeless, tired world. My question to you is, what happens when the messengers of these messages are tired themselves? What happens when we're feeling burnt out or silently struggling? We all have learned to put on our fine faces. Does anyone know what fine stands for? Yeah, or feeling insecure, neurotic, and emotional. Anyone feeling fine? Suddenly we don't want to admit it, do we? So in preparation, God led me to, I'm going to see if I can do multitask here. There you go. I like it. All right. Romans 12 verse 2 says this: do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And when I read this verse, I see a command, a warning, and an instruction. A command, do not conform. A warning, do not conform to the patterns of this world, and an instruction to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So if God is calling us to be kingdom voices, then we need to make sure that we are not culture conformers. And I don't know about you, but we live in a world that has a very loud voice sometimes. And I've been in spaces where you try and speak counterculture, and you can almost feel the spiritual opposition pushing back against you. So I want to encourage you that if we're going to be transformed by changing the way we think, then we need to consider, what are the ways that I'm thinking that are unhelpful? Are there patterns of this world that have shaped our thinking, that have shaped what we present, what we share, what we kind of say? Because healing isn't personal, it's missional. healing isn't always personal, it's missional. Because then we become true ambassadors for Christ of what it means to be hope. In the world of media, your voice isn't just telling stories, it's actually shaping and influencing culture. Think about it. Every podcast, broadcast, article, film carries the power to plant values, to provoke thoughts, and to pull hearts closer to God, who is the truth. So, when your voice is renewed by the kingdom values, it is no longer used to just entertain the world, but it has the power to transform it. And that's why I believe it is so crucial that we make sure we are not conforming to the patterns of this world. So I want to speak into some of these patterns, because often people kind of go, well, I want to change who I am. And I think it was Craig Groeschel who first said, you can't defeat what you haven't first defined. So let's define the patterns that we want to defeat, so that we can be clear when we see them come past, because the enemy is very deceptive. He is called the father of all lies, which doesn't mean he's mediocre. It means he's really good. Okay? He's going to make the patterns of the world look good. He made eating the fruit, the one and only rule that God gave, look good. Can you see how deceptive he is? So when we look at this dynamic of don't conform, we're talking about mind and character. Don't conform in mind and character to the patterns of this world. And I want to speak about three mindsets, three patterns that I've seen not only in the counseling room, but if you just follow media, you'll see it everywhere. These mindsets have corroded the foundations of mental health and spiritual well-being. These are three mindsets that are deeply entrenched in this world's culture. These are mindsets that are actually celebrated and encouraged as a currency for self-worth and value. I'm going to say that again. The mindsets I'm going to be speaking about are encouraged and celebrated as the currency for self-worth and value. These mindsets drive us, they crack silent whips, whilst they quietly break us. Okay? And these three mindsets that we're going to be looking at is the mindset of perform and produce, of compete and compare, and strive and survive. And we're going to unpack those, and then I'm going to give us some kingdom principles to counteract them. So let's first look at perform and produce. I don't know about you, but when I consider the culture of this world, we see the patterns where the education system grades you, the business sector evaluates you, the sporting world ranks you, social media likes you, and media entertains you. Am I right? It's a very strong culture from very young that shapes the mindset that performance and production is really important. And you will hear that in and of itself, performance and production is not wrong. But when it shapes your identity and your self-worth and your value, it's a very, very dangerous platform. And it's interesting, when I was doing research on what does it mean to live under performance and production, it reminds me of the story of the Tower of Babel, where there was this drive, this need to make a name for ourselves. And I just want to read to you Genesis 11 verse 4. It says this: Then they said, come, let us build. Can you hear the language of perform and produce? Ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens. Not just any tower, the best of the best, the highest of the highest, so that we can make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. And in a sense, the drive was pure rebellion against the command of God. He said, go out into the world. They didn't want to go out into the world. They wanted to make a name for themselves instead in the world. So I want to show you through demonstration, because I like props and having a bit of fun, what does it mean to build a name for ourselves, and what happens from a mental health perspective when we invest in trying to build a name for ourselves. So I need a competitive volunteer who has a steady hand and would like to play a game of Jenga. Anybody? Anybody want to have a little Jenga? Oh, I see a hand in the back. Thank you. Come on through. KG. Jenga. This is Jenga. Okay, don't bump the table. All right. So what KG's going to do, have you ever played Jenga before? You think so? The goal is that you've got to take out blocks and build a tower. Okay? Apparently the world record, no, it's fine over there. The world record is 54 levels. So if you don't beat that, sorry KG, but you have no name. Like your name is actually worthless. All right? It's a lot of pressure. The pressure for excellence, performance, production. Okay, so whilst KG is building a name for himself through trying to beat the world record, I'm going to speak about what starts to happen when we live following the patterns of this world. And I've got an acronym here, Jenga. Because the first thing we do when we start to build, when we start to produce and create, we actually place ourselves in a position of being judged. Because now everybody's watching, right? Everybody's got an opinion. Everybody's got a strategy of how things should go, how things should be. And we feel this constant evaluation, not only from external, but even from internal. It's in places of performance that even critical voices from our past can reappear. You're not enough. Is this the best you can do? E for Jenga stands for judgment. For expectations. Because often, externally or internally, there's always the pressure to do more. That pressure, the expectation of is what I'm doing enough? And that's what the N stands for, the enough. Which becomes that silent whip that drives us to give more, do more, go higher, be more, produce more. And when is it enough? When can we truly say we have reached where it is that we're meant to be? In a world of performance and production, it's always up and to the right, and that right never ends. And it creates this huge pressure on us. At the same time, there's the guilt. The guilt if we feel like we're failing expectations. The guilt that we feel if we feel like we're failing our own level of production, performance. And alongside the guilt is the anxiety. The anxiety is always about uncertainty. Because I never know how the performance is going to go. I never know if the production, what I'm producing, is going to hit the mark. What happens if I miss the mark? What happens if it's not enough? What happens if I'm not enough? And we live in a world, because there's no absolute truth and everything's driven by performance, that anxiety is going through the roof. And there's this mindset that if I'm not enough, then what? Because when I'm trying to build a name for myself, what happens when? Sorry, I just destroyed your name. Was he getting there? Okay, close. Okay, you kind of have value. Sorry, you do have value. All right. Okay, how many of you relate to the pressure of performance and production? How many of you can identify with that Jenga in your own life? Well, that's just one of the mindsets that we're going to look at. Because performance and production then leads to competitiveness and comparison. And in the patterns of this world, the mindset of compete and compare often results in individualism and competitiveness, because suddenly now everyone else around you is a threat. Because if we had to have another table with another Jenga on it and two different people building at the same time, the enemy is going to want to cause you to look at the other person through the lens of this person is not for you, but they're against you. So let's look at the Jenga of compete and compare. Ecclesiastes 4 verse 4 says this: "Then I observed that most people are motivated to success because they envy their neighbors. But this too is meaningless, like chasing the wind." So let's look at the Jenga of compete and compare. The first is jealousy. What happens if someone else is doing better than you? How do we process that emotion if our mindset is driven first by perform and produce, and now we're competing and comparing, and someone else is building better than me? Because someone knocked my tower over, and that's not fair. And no one bumped their tower over. They started maybe with a giant Jenga, and I started with a silly plastic Jenga. That's not, can you see the danger of these mindsets that can lead to a place of jealousy? When you're constantly driven to compete and compare, exhaustion will eventually set in. Because the pressure to maintain, if you get the world title this year, there's a pressure to maintain it next year. And everyone else that's coming behind you is a threat to your performance and your production. The danger also of competing and comparing is we find ourselves neglecting our calling. Sorry, I see it says never of calling. It should be neglecting our calling. I'm a confidently bad speller. So every now and then I do find a glitch. It's neglecting our calling. And the reason we can do that is because we end up chasing the wrong lane. We find ourselves in different lanes because we become so competitive, because we're chasing after the wrong things. And if you're coming in last place, second to last place, third to last place, there's the grumbling, the internal disconnect that can slowly become bitterness. And that's the mental decline, where the narratives we start telling ourselves is there's something wrong with me, I'm not enough. Sometimes we counteract that with approval addiction, where we try and find ways to perform elsewhere in order to feed that empty pit. We need the applause. This is what I call anxiety-easing drugs. And the danger is that whatever you escape to, you can become enslaved by. Whatever you escape to, you can become enslaved by. You can see that both the fruits of performance and production and competitiveness and comparison lead to mental and emotional chaos. These are mindsets that don't bring life, they actually long-term bring death. The sad thing that if I'm living under the mindset of to perform and to produce and to compete and to compare, eventually I find myself in the state of striving and surviving. Sad thing is that the patterns of this world brag about busyness. There was a time and a place where if you were doing 60, 80-hour weeks, like it was an Audi badge that you could walk around with. This bragging about burnout. Man, I'm so exhausted. Oh, yeah, me too. I'm even more exhausted with you. It was this, we were competing over who was the most exhausted, who was the most, burnt out. Self-sufficiency and self-preservation is almost badges that we wear of honor. I don't need. Do you know the only time that wretched, the word wretched is used in Scripture, other than when Paul called himself wretched, is when Jesus called the church, I think it's in Laodicea or Laodicea, one of those places, something like that. He called them wretched. They were a church that were known for their self-sufficiency. They were rich, they owned this eye cream, and they had wool for making clothing. And Jesus called them the opposite of their self-sufficiency, poor, blind, and naked. In God's eyes, self-sufficiency, I can do this, I don't need anyone, I'm striving, I'm surviving, I'm seeing this as a badge of honor. God calls that wretched. Self-sufficiency, self-preservation, self-reliance, self-determination, self-protection, from a worldly perspective, are seen as strengths. But from a godly perspective, as I said, it's wretched. Galatians 3:3 says, how foolish can you be? After starting your new lives in the Spirit, why are you now trying to become perfect by your own human effort? And the Jenga for strive and survive, and this is what happens when we are striving for our own perfection, when we are trying to earn our sense of worth, is we become jaded. Emotional fatigue from prolonged striving. We start to look for those escaping behaviors, the need to run from hard emotions because I don't want to feel anymore. It's too much. Long term, the fruit, we are numb. We are numb because it's easier to not feel. We're guarded, especially over the little we have left. And we're alone. The fruit of isolation in order to survive. Can you see the patterns of this world? Are kind of candy-coated lies, aren't they? It's like those tablets that have that thin layer of candy on, so that you can put it in your mouth without tasting the bitterness of the pill, but suck that pill long enough and you will taste the bitterness. And that's the deceptive lies of the enemy. That it's packaged in this production and performance is important. You know, we want to do well. And let me say it again. There's nothing wrong in and of itself to perform and to produce. But when your identity, when your worth, when your value is tied to the results, that's when we find ourselves in chaos. So let's go back to Romans 12, verse 2. It says, don't conform to the patterns of this world. We've looked at the patterns of this world, but it says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So we need to look at then, there's a pattern of this world, but then what is the pattern of God? And so I want to speak into these and then give you some tools for transforming our minds. We're going to change performing and producing to believing and belonging. Genesis 1:26 says this. Then God said, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. You see, we're not called to be name builders. We are called to be name bearers. To be made in the image of God means you reflect his name. I have two sons, and everyone always tells us you can see, are Deyzels. They look like my husband. My one son looks like me. Some say, my husband always goes, oh, you're a Nixon, and the other boy, he says, you're a Deyzel. Because there is this reflection. We reflect who we are made by. But we're also made in his likeness. And that means we are reflecting his nature. You see, image is about who you are, and likeness is about how you act. We're called to look like God and live like God. And I think sometimes we rely on the look like God instead of the living like God. And I'm so aware, as I said, when I listen to people's stories, that the enemy wants to distract us with name building instead of name bearing. Why? Because he knows that when we grasp the truth of the name in whose image we have been made, the name that is above all names, that we will be the most powerful. So he would rather distract you by believing you need to build a name so that you don't have a revelation of the name that already exists and dwells in you. You see, the mindset of a slave builds for his master, where the mindset of a son bears the name of his father. So how do we subtly speak these truths as we use the platforms that we have? Because you can hear the culture currency is always about building to make a name great versus bearing the greatest name. The world's way is to be a name builder. The kingdom's way is to be a name bearer. The world's way is telling us that our worth is based in what we do. And I counsel those who have failed at what they do and are now living with a mindset of, I am a failure. You see, the enemy wants you to believe that what you do equals who you are. If you're successful, then that means you are great. And of course, he wants you to chase after that. But at the same time, if you fail, he's going to flip it. Well, if you fail, it means you are a failure. So you might as well climb under the table and never try again. Can you see how both ways he distracts you from actually the calling that God has for us? Kingdom's way, your worth is not based on what you do. It's based on whose you are. Do you know the truth about who you are? The world says we need to compete and compare. God says we need to partner in purpose. Ephesians 4:16 says this: He makes the whole body fit together perfectly, as each part does its own special work. It helps other parts grow so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. I look at this room and I see a room full of parts. And each part has its own special work. And as each part does its own special work, so the whole body is healthy and growing. Imagine if this was a room full of just voices. Imagine if the body were just an eye. Where would its sense of hearing be? The eye cannot say to the ear, I don't need you. Imagine seeing random eyes hopping off into the distance, going, I'm not being a part of this body because nobody hears me. No, we're designed to be our individual, unique parts. We're not called to live a life of individualism, because if we do, we'll see each other as threats, competitive threats. Instead, we've been joined together in unity, and this is so counterculture, isn't it? The world is all about me, myself, and Irene. But God is saying, no, it's about unity and love. And the enemy will try and use the mindset and the schemes to divide, distract, divert, deceive, defeat, delay, disqualify, and destroy when it comes to the plans and purposes of God. If he can't destroy your identity, then he's going to do everything in his power to destroy God's destiny, his purposes. You see, the mindset of an individual is that it's for the good of self. But the mindset of a body part is that it's for the good of the whole. I don't know about you, but a month ago, I twisted my ankle. Wasn't a bad sprain. But I know that in church, out the church, people hurt, don't they? How many of you have been hurt by a person? Okay. How many of you, if you were hurt by a person, would phone up a friend and go, yeah, you know that foot of mine? Yeah, the one that I've been taking to Bible college every day? Yeah. Well, that person totally broke and twisted and dropped me. Yeah, they let me down completely. You know what? I'm never going to trust that person again. I'm not going to feed them. I'm not going to bathe them. I'm not going to even put a sock on them. In fact, I'm going to discard them. We see that in the church, don't we? Hurt parts, hurt parts. But God is calling us not to trust each other. Trust is a commodity that is only deserving of someone who is trustworthy. And Scripture is very clear, we're all fallen. God doesn't call us to trust each other. God calls us to love each other. We're called to love each other. Our trust is in God, but we're also called to love each other. When my ankle twisted, I didn't trust it for a while. I still don't trust it. I've got boots on, so I've got a supported ankle, okay, strapping it up. But I love it. I love it enough to support it so that it heals. I'm not about individualism. My left foot is not about itself. It wants to make sure that my right foot gets well and strong. Do we have that mindset in the church? So how differently would you be living your life if you understood the power of your heart, of your part in the role of the whole? You see, the world says the drive is based on who you beat. But God's kingdom says the drive is based on who you bless. And if we even bless those that hurt us, our enemies, we turn the other cheek. How are we processing these mindsets? Challenging. The last one I want to speak into is shifting the mindset of striving and surviving to abiding and rising. John 15, verse 5, Jesus says, I am the vine and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Because apart from me, you can do nothing. How many of you have ever felt the pressure of content production? The striving to come up with more. I often talk to pastors about this, and they're like, man, there's only so many ways you can talk about Christmas and Easter. But every year, the world wants a different creative sermon on the same thing. And I feel that pressure as a counselor. There's only so many ways you can talk about renewing the mind, but every time you speak, someone wants something new and creative when it comes to renewing the mind. And this can put huge pressure. The world keeps telling us, give more, dig deeper, hustle harder. Jesus says, no, abide. Because it's from that place that you rise. And the good news is everything we need already exists. In the beginning was the Word. Everything we need already exists. So why are we striving to do it in our own strength? You see, the world's way is based on pressure and results, but God's way is based on peace and rest. So, how do we transform our minds? We've looked at the different narratives, the narratives of the world versus the narratives of God. So what does it mean to be transformed? The Greek word for transform is metamorpho. What does that sound like? It's exactly where the word metamorphosis comes from. Meta means change and morph means form. We need to change our form. In a sense, what God is calling us to do in terms of be transformed means we are the original transformers. Did you know that every time you think a thought, it's the equivalent of walking across a grassy field? If you think that thought once, there's no pathway. But if you think that thought again and again and again, eventually you produce a pathway in your mind. They're called neuropathways. Now, in order to transform my mind, if I choose to change the way I think, and I choose to think a different thought, I'm now producing a new pathway. But here's the good news. Every time I stop myself from going down an old thought, and instead choosing to think a new thought, from a scientific medical perspective, there are little barricades that go up on the old pathway. And if there are enough barricades on that old pathway, eventually that old pathway disappears. So when God says, be transformed, He has given us the ability to literally change the structure of our brains just by changing the way we think. We can actually physically transform, change the structure, original transformers, our brains. They've taken photographs of this and shown the difference, what's happening in the minds. So this type of change is not just behavior modification. Because as a man thinks in his heart, so he is. Did you know there are 40,000 neurons in your heart? There is a small brain in your heart. As you think in your heart, so you are. It will drive the way you behave. God is not looking for behavior modification. He's looking for inner renewal and a foundation of laying our identity on the right foundations. Who Jesus says we are, not what production says we are. 1 Peter 1:13 says, prepare your minds for action. We live in a world where we need to be prepared. The King James Version says, wherefore, gird up the loins of your mind. You kind of want to say that in a Scottish accent, don't you? You know, with a deeper guttural voice. Gird up the loins of your mind. Did I do it out there? So what does it mean to gird up the loins of your mind? To gird means to be unimpeded in movement by binding a flowing garment to your body with a belt. You see, in biblical times, men would wear long tunics. And if they were going to gird up the loins of their minds or gird up their tunics, they would have to pull up their dresses, get a belt and tie it around their waist. Why? So that when they go into battle, they don't trip over the hem of their garments. That's what it means to gird up your loins. It means to mentally or physically be prepared for a fight, an enormous task, to be prepared to go into battle. When you are going to come against the patterns of this world, believe me, you're going into battle. You need to be mindful of the battleground, the territory that you are entering. Because I'm telling you now, there's going to be pushback. Ephesians 6 verse 14 takes it even deeper. It says to us, stand your ground by putting on the belt of truth and the body armor of God's righteousness. The King James Version says, stand therefore, having girded your loins with truth. So you can prepare for a battle by putting on a belt to hook up your dress, or you can prepare for a battle by putting on the belt truth around your mind. To be prepared. Why do we need to be prepared? Well, as I said, we are entering into a battle. Ephesians 6:16 says this, in addition to this, take up the shield of faith with which we can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Now you might be going, well, I haven't seen a flaming arrow around much, you know. And whenever I think of flaming arrows, I always think of Mel Gibson in Braveheart, where they would take an arrow, dip it in fuel, light it, and shoot it into the thatch of buildings, just like this one. Why? With the hope that it would catch fire and burn from the top down. This is your thatch. Your mind is your thatch. Listen to 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5. We destroy every proud obstacle, which includes flaming arrows, that keeps people from knowing God. We capture rebellious thoughts, and we teach them to obey Christ. That word thought is the word neoma. The word neoma means a thought with an evil intention. Did you know that every thought that comes into your mind doesn't always originate from you or God? That there are thoughts that come from the enemy. I want to read through just a couple of other scriptures where this word neoma is used. 2 Corinthians 10:5. I'm going to fly through them. We destroy every proud, 2 Corinthians 2:11. In order that Satan might not outwit us, for we are not unaware of his schemes. That word scheme, neoma. 2 Corinthians 4:4. Satan, who is the god of this world, has blinded the minds, neoma, of those who don't believe. 2 Corinthians 11:3. But I'm afraid that just as Eve was deceived by the serpent's cunning ways, your minds, neoma, may somehow be led astray from your sincere and pure devotion to Christ. What is our battleground? The mind. Let me just say this. The only power a neoma has of you is if you agree with it. You see, it's when you agree with neomas that they become your beliefs. When you agree with the patterns of this world, they will become the drives to what you do behaviorally. As humans, we have on average 60,000 thoughts a day. 70 to 80% of those thoughts are negative. And 95 to 98% of them are repetitive. Let me ask you this question. How often do you think about what you're thinking about? When was the last time you went on a thinking date? To consider your thoughts. Hosea says people perish because of a lack of knowledge, and that includes self-awareness. If I'm not thinking about what I'm thinking about, if I'm just blindly reacting, if I'm just blindly driven by the patterns and the customs of this world, and not considering the thought narrative behind it, Because there are narratives that bring life, and there are narratives that bring death. And often it's the narratives that bring death that are disguised as the ones that bring life. That's what it means to be deceived. At the same time, the human body sends to the brain 11 million bits of information per second to be processed. 11 million per second is coming at your brain. You are only consciously aware of 50 of them. 50 out of 11 million. Have you ever changed car brands? Maybe you're driving a Toyota and suddenly you see a friend's got the latest Mahindra or whatever it is. Can you see why the battlefield is our minds? That we need to own. We need to become more consciously aware of the stories we tell ourselves. Because Scripture says it's not emotion that sets us free, it's truth. And too often we're allowing our emotions to be our truth barometers. What I feel. I feel great when I succeed, so therefore it's good for me. But what happens when your tower falls? What happens to your sense of value? How differently would you be living your life if you fully understood and knew in the depth of your soul what it means to be a son or daughter of the King? That your worth and your value does not change no matter what you do. For years, I struggled with insecurities because I honestly thought I was stupid. I was an undiagnosed dyslexic. I wasn't in the A class, the B class, or the C class. I was in the G class, and G didn't stand for good grades. And because of that, I couldn't get into university, so I became a qualified hairdresser. I worked with my hands until I got to 25, and I got accepted into Bible college in London as a mature student. But most of the time, I didn't understand what they were talking about because they used words so big, I couldn't even spell them. And I would go into the library because you couldn't take books out back then, and I would read the same passage 12 times and still not know what it was saying because dyslexics need to read out loud, and you couldn't in libraries back then. So the story I told myself was I'm stupid, and God can't use me. I better just go back to being a hairdresser. Until one day a friend of mine said to me, "Didn't God speak through a donkey?" And I'm like, I don't know if you're encouraging me or insulting me. But yes, he did once speak through a donkey. I guess if he speaks through a donkey, he can speak through a stuttering dyslexic. And for years, I thought that is what defines me. And then I realized, no, it's who Jesus says I am that defines me. Now I tell people I'm a confidently bad speller, and I'm about to publish my 3rd book. Because you see, to be a kingdom voice doesn't mean you need to have all the qualifications. You just need to have the name above all names living inside of you. And when we start to speak that message, we start to change the culture of our world. Philippians 4 verse 8, I've got two verses to end with, says this. Now, dear brothers and sisters, now, dear kingdom voices. I changed it. Did you see what I did there? One final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and honorable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Again, are you thinking about what you're thinking about? We need to take ownership of our minds instead of allowing the neomas of the enemy to take ownership of us. And lastly, wherever you are in your journey, whatever you may be wrestling with, Scripture is very clear. It tells us, don't worry about anything. Don't you hate it when someone tells you that when you're worrying? Do you know what I'm saying? Don't worry about anything. You see, the root word for worry, which is also anxiety, means to choke. Worry will I can do, prayer is something that makes me powerful, where worry makes me powerless. So God's saying, don't be powerless, be powerful. Don't worry, rather pray. Instead, tell God what you need. Engage in a conversation with him. Journey with him. Thank him for all he's done. I've started a narrative with God, and it sounds cumbersome, but it's actually become a real joy. Every time I push the button and my car starts, there's a little part of me that goes, oh, thank you, sweet Jesus, I have a car. Every time I get into bed, I put my head in the pillow. Lord, thank you for the privilege of this roof over my head. When I fly and I land, thank you, Lord, that the wheels touch down. When I hug my children, thank you for the privilege of today that I get to be a parent. Show gratitude. Then here comes the promise. Then you experience God's peace. The biblical definition of peace is this. It is the tranquil state of a soul, your soul being your mind, your will, and your emotions. It's the tranquil state of your soul, assured of its salvation, despite this earthly lot. Why was Paul able to praise in a prison? He knew the secret of being content. The secret was God's peace, that nothing could separate him from the love of God. Nothing could take away salvation. That peace exceeds anything we can understand from a worldly perspective. Your tower may fall, but your peace will stand because the name above all names lives inside of you. And this peace is what guards your hearts and your minds as you live in Christ Jesus. Amen.